Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Data-centric Security, Risks and Emerging Threats in Government, sponsored by Adobe. On federalnewsradio.com at 1500 AM, I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest is John Landwehr, the public sector CTO of Adobe. Now, John, we were talking a lot in the first segment about some of the initiatives that have been going on in the government, whether it's two-factor authentication through HSPD-12 or FedRAMP to really get people more comfortable with cloud and security. Let's take it a step down a little bit and talk more specifics around really the move to data-centric security. We've brought this up several times. There's a lot of policies, there's a lot of movement that we've seen the Cybersecurity National Action Plan really call for protecting the data. What really is that move? What does it mean? Help us define that.
Well, whereas the perimeter protection was really about creating a border around your network so that outside people couldn't get in, data-centric security is about protecting the data at the data layer, independent of storage, independent of transport, anywhere that data goes. And we see an architecture that's really best described in three dimensions of information protection, where the first dimension is what most agencies are already doing with some sort of virtual file cabinet on the network. And they're able to provide a login for authorized users and then a list of authorizations on which users have access to effectively what drawer or file folder in that cabinet. But the challenge with that single dimension in a content management system is once the user goes in and pulls that content out of the file cabinet, how do you know where that content goes after it's been sent over a network to an end user device like a laptop, a smartphone, or a tablet? And further, what do you do about the system administrators that have access to that virtual file cabinet to make sure that they don't accidentally or intentionally leak all the files that are being stored there? So that's really what the first dimension is about, is that file cabinet. And where the second dimension ties in is using digital rights management technology to encrypt all of the content before it goes into that content management system. Now, it can still be indexed and searched, but anytime that content is pulled out and subsequently opened on an end user device, it requires the user to authenticate, say with their PIV card or usernames and passwords or one-time password tokens. And then it also checks the authorization list back on that server to say, okay, John Landwehr has this file. Does he still have access to it? And it can check that authorization list for a list of users or groups or roles or attributes to make sure every time that content is interacted with, the user who has the file has the rights to view it. And then it securely protects not only the viewing, but you can restrict printing, you can restrict modifying, you can even restrict copy and pasting of that document. So it really becomes just a view-only lens onto that document. And then the third dimension that wraps all that together is where you incorporate the audit information, the logging that comes from the content management system, the logging that comes from the rights management system, to look for unusual behavior. For instance, let's say I only access maybe 10 sensitive documents a day. And here's a day that the log shows I downloaded 100 documents in 5 minutes, but didn't open any of them, right? The advances in software can now look at that information real time and see, okay, there's somebody trying to open an excessive number of documents, or there's somebody that's trying to print a lot of documents. In real time, the security analytics aggregates all that information from these multiple sources to help inform organizations where the sensitive content may be about to be leaked. But the nice thing about pulling all those dimensions together is that if the content somehow does leave the organization, does leave that perimeter through accidents or insiders or attacks, it remains persistently protected and secure at that file layer.
And that's part of the challenge that agencies are facing, is that they're not necessarily encrypting their data in motion. They maybe have gotten a little better at encrypting their data at rest, but the data in motion piece, which is what you kind of described using the DRM, the digital rights management technology, do you see that's the biggest opportunity in many ways for agencies?
Well, as you mentioned, there are a lot of ways you can encrypt content. And it's important, of course, to have disk encryption or container encryption, whether it's on your servers or your end user devices. It's also important to encrypt the network sessions, whereas we see the yellow padlock in web browsers to say that this is an SSL session. But moving to that second dimension of rights management also encrypts the data at the data layer and effectively provides then multiple layers of encryption. So you've got an encrypted container with separately encrypted content in it. You've got an encrypted pipe with separately encrypted content flowing through it. And different keys are effectively used on the storage and network than on the content, which also helps ensure that no single person in an organization, again, can accidentally or intentionally make all that content vulnerable.
It sounds really complicated, what you just described, the multiple layers of encryption. And then if I'm a user going, how am I going to get to my data? I need to have access to my data. Is there a balance that most agencies or most organizations can strike to make sure they do have enough encryption, but it's not so much encryption that I just can't do my job?
Well, with any security technology, ease of use is paramount, because if you make it too difficult, people won't use it or won't use it correctly. And that's one of the things that's actually elegant about the PIV card that we talked about, because that's providing so much more security, but also providing a great benefit of stronger security, not remembering a password with multi-factor authentication. And that segues perfectly into rights management. So if I have already authenticated by putting my card in the computer and typing in my PIN code, when I go to open a protected document, it just opens right away. There's not a whole bunch of other scary dialog boxes that pop open that make me go through multiple steps. Double click or tap on a device. I've already authenticated. It just opens. But if I don't have rights to view that content, then I will get a dialog box that says, sorry, you don't have access to this. And then, of course, you can provide more information on where to go, perhaps if you should have access when you don't, on who to call, the help desk, that sort of thing.
When I think about who's doing this well in government, I don't have a lot of examples. I think the Defense Department may be the one that's the furthest ahead of all civilian agencies. Can you think of some examples or some areas where this idea of this data-centric security is being implemented and done well?
We've seen it implemented in a number of areas across the public sector. One example is protecting healthcare information. So in state medical systems, they had an issue with information that was leaking out, and by switching to data-centric security on those healthcare records, again, they were able to persistently protect them independent of storage, independent of transport. Another area that we see rights management in place is actually college transcripts. So no longer do they do the fancy watermarked paper that's postal mailed. They wanted to go digital, but they wanted to make sure that it was protecting the PII of the graduating students, and also the authenticity and integrity of that data, because you don't want smart computer science graduates to change their A- to A+, right? So they use the encryption technology not only to control who has access to the transcript with the PII, but also to provide that electronic seal, which can show up as a blue ribbon on the document that nobody's tampered with this document after a institution had published it. And then there are also areas of protecting intellectual property, whether it's in the commercial manufacturing space that's highly competitive, especially globally, and even the defense industrial base, where you have mission-critical machinery that's being produced, that you also want to make sure you're protecting not only the intellectual property for competitive advantage, but also managing export controls for ITAR compliance, for instance.
Are you starting to see this also in the federal government? I know maybe you don't want to specifically name agencies, but are they starting to get this idea? I mean, we've heard a lot about, for instance, roles-based back-end authentication as part of this process to say who has rights and when do they have the ability to look at something. But you hear that a lot. It's still in pilots. People are still testing it. You don't hear, when I talk to CIOs, for instance, I'm not hearing them talk about this type of encryption and digital rights management. Do you feel like that this is starting to catch on? People are starting to get it because of the breaches we've seen?
I think the pieces are coming together now for the federal government. Again, as we've discussed today, the identification of the high-value assets so they know what to protect. The PIV cards with HSPD-12 to know who has access to it, the FedRAMP authorization to make sure that the systems that are being deployed through third-party cloud service providers are meeting or exceeding the greatest cloud security standards that have been established on the planet with FedRAMP. And now having an architecture that pulls all those together in 3 dimensions with preventative and detective controls to protect what we're seeing as PII, certainly in a lot of forms within the government, pockets also of healthcare information, because I think that's another area with increasing concern of all that sensitive information, private information that people have. And certainly the IP and Homeland Security information is another aspect that we're seeing a lot of movement toward as well.
So if I'm an agency and I'm listening to our conversation, which I expect them to be listening, of course, do you get us? What kind of advice would you give somebody who says, okay, we have the HSPD-12 cards, the PIV cards, we're starting to use them for network access. We've done the high value data assets things because OMB made us. What do I do next? Where do I go next? What kind of advice or best practices would you point out?
Well, I think there are several. One is certainly to take the opportunity to talk to others in government who have done this and learn from their shared experiences. And we're always happy to help provide those introductions and facilitation that can help government learn from each other and get up and running quickly. And I think the next area really is then, okay, when you're embracing new technology, starting with a pilot, looking at, okay, here is a well-defined pocket of information that we want to protect and try this out. And fortunately, the technology is not only available to be deployed on-premise in traditional IT fashion, but the content-centric security through rights management is even available as a cloud service that people can get up and running without having to make a big investment of knowing which data center, how much space they have, how much cooling, how much network, how much power they have to add yet another server. The FedRAMP and cloud environment is making it very easy for agencies to do these pilots and test this technology very quickly. And then lastly, it would be education, so that as this is being rolled out to the business owners, the content owners, and ultimately the end users, people understand what's being deployed there, understand that these new controls are available, which in many cases enables them to better protect information as well as access it from other devices, including telecommuting, so that when people do need to quickly get to sensitive information on a tablet or smartphone, they can do that. So it's really holistically tying all those pieces together in a stepwise fashion is a great way to start.
John, that's great advice. Very much enjoyed our conversation today, but unfortunately we're out of time. You've been listening to the panel discussion, Data-centric Security, Risks and Emerging Threats in Government, sponsored by Adobe on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'd like to thank my guests, John Landwehr, the Public Sector CTO at Adobe, and the Honorable Michael Chertoff, the former Secretary of the Homeland Security Department and an Adobe Public Sector Advisor. I'm your host, Jason Miller. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search Adobe.
On behalf of Adobe, thank you for joining us. A link to the archive session will be sent to you shortly. If you requested a training certificate, you will also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.